failed first time. You're trying to get the mic out. Is that on?
Yep.
Working? Okay. If I sort of start waving my arms around and it means you can't hear the mic, just let me know, and I'll try and focus on keeping it close. David, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you all for coming along on a beautiful, beautiful Glasgow morning. I think it'd be much better for our well-being if we were up in the hills, basking in the sun. But hopefully, this is maybe second or third best option. David asked me to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that are in this book that we had out earlier this year. It's called The Economics of Arrival. I wrote that with Jeremy Williams. I get very embarrassed because he tells the story often that when we first started writing the book, his baby daughter had just been born, and then he says, and she's now 5 years old. And I think, oh, Jeremy, it's tragic how long it took us to pull together this book, sort of eking out pieces of writing around our respective day jobs. But hopefully it's landed at the right time, because it speaks to a lot of the sort of questions that are happening around climate and environmental breakdown and inequality, and what the very purpose of the economy is about. And it tries to get away from this false binary that all growth is all bad or all growth is necessarily good. I was doing a talk earlier this week at the University of Glasgow, and one of my fellow panellists was rolling out what I would, I guess, rather dismissively call sort of 1980s orthodox thinking, saying rising tide will lift all the boats. Those sorts of things, growth has been brilliant for growth has lifted millions of people out of poverty. And that sort of blinkered approach to economic growth is, I think, partly that's got us into some of the challenges that we're facing today. But it's undeniable that when growth is used well, when it's used to invest in collective institutions like education systems or our health services, and when it's directed to those who need it most, so when it's pro-poor, then growth can have very, very significant benefits in terms of various aspects of social progress. And I'll come to that. But what we tried to do in the book is step through some of the complexity around that and really take off that very blinkered black and white approach to growth and really get a sense of when it's good, when it's bad, when it's harmful, when it's useful. So where we get to is a point that we think it's perhaps time to ask: are the fruits of growth that have been attained over the last few decades, if you like, are they beginning to rot? And you see, sorry for the formatting here, you see that in that it's an increasingly unsafe mode of growth, and we're seeing with more and more frequency the louder and louder warnings from scientists about the extent of environmental breakdown and biodiversity loss. And you probably can't read it here, but this report is this is a global assessment on biodiversity, and that came out earlier this year. And this report points very much to the relentless pursuit of economic growth. So the scientists are saying we've got to have a look at these growth-based economic models as one of the root causes of environmental breakdown. And on top of the louder and louder calls from scientists, we're of course seeing our students and others coming out of their classrooms in more and more numbers, week after week, saying enough of the political recalcitrance in the face of the fear that they have for communities around the world and for their own futures. So it's an unsafe form of growth. And of course that's happening in Scotland too. We're seeing Scotland being battered by more fierce storms. We're seeing unprecedentedly early levels of grassmore fires earlier this year, completely out of season. And that's causing a very human impact. Friends of the Earth just a few years ago reported that we're looking at about 2,500 deaths just from air pollution. To the extent that Earth system scientists are now saying we're now in a new geological era. We're no longer in the Goldilocks era of the Holocene, where it wasn't too hot or it wasn't too cold. We're now in a new geological era that's been called the Anthropocene, in that it's human beings who are putting most pressure on the planet. And then some people have taken a second look at that and said, actually, maybe we should be calling it the Plutocene, because not everyone has equal impact in terms of pressure on the planet. And this is a chart that I've been showing for a while. It was created by my former colleagues in the Oxfam research team. And what they did is they mapped the consumption-based emissions for CO2. So that's consumption according to what it is you're consuming. So it takes into account production that's done offshore. And they mapped that by income deciles across the world. And it rather ironically emerges as a champagne, one of those old 1950s champagne glasses, because you can see here that it's the top 10% that are responsible for almost half of the world's CO2 emissions in that consumption-based analysis, whereas the poorest half of the world's population, and of course these are the communities that are hit hardest by the impacts of environmental breakdown, who are least responsible, actually in total responsible for only 10% of global consumption-based CO2 emissions. So it's very unequal. And that inequality in terms of impact on the planet, of course, is replicated in terms of inequality in terms of access to various economic resources. So it's an unevenly shared harvest. We've seen that the economic system has done too little to meet the needs of those who are struggling to get by just to the end of the week, but at the same time has done so much to enrich those people whose wealth will make more money for them than you or I could make in a day. And so this is an example of the Pluto scene. These are sort of the individuals who have extraordinary access to wealth and power and who make their money through rents, the so-called rentier economy. Skip through that. And so we've got fairly orthodox economic measures, like my friend the other day saying a rising tide will lift all boats, probably this person who will also say, the fundamentals of the economy are doing quite well. And then when so many people are feeling that the economic ground on which they stand is more and more unsteady, they're anxious about can they put food on the table, can they heat their houses, could they deal with an unexpected bill? And in Scotland as well, can you see that? Or do I need to turn the lights down a little bit? I'll read them out, which is, I know, really bad form in terms of PowerPoint. But in terms of Scotland, we often think like to think of ourselves as more equal than the rest of the world at least, and more equal than so many other countries, and we have our gaze on Nordic countries. Well, Sheffield University has said actually Scotland is becoming much more like the UK in terms of our economic inequality and less Nordic. And we see that in that the top 1% in Scotland have as much as the half of the Scottish population. So in terms of economic wealth, very, very unevenly shared. You'll know this, that 1 million people living in poverty, a quarter of children almost living in relative poverty. In terms of financial resources, we see the least wealthy households having much less access to pensions, to property wealth, to financial wealth. And of course, how that manifests in terms of hunger in the 5th or 6th richest country in the world. And of course, you will not be very familiar with this, that socioeconomic gradient in terms of what that means in life expectancy. So those fundamentals in Scotland, I'd say the ones we should perhaps pay much more attention to what we're usually told are the economic fundamentals, paint a pretty bleak picture of how Scotland's going in terms of our unevenly shared harvest. And so it's also an economic growth system, an economic model that's dependent on economic growth, that's unsafe in terms of environmental breakdown, it's unevenly shared, but it's also an economic growth system that hurts. We're seeing rising levels of loneliness. We see that 50% of people across Europe say they don't have any time to do what they enjoy. We say that 8 out of 10 schools saying that they've seen increased levels of self-harm and suicidal thoughts amongst their students. We see young people particularly reporting loneliness. Globally, we know that depression is the number one global burden of disease, and people just feeling insecure and anxious and precarious and alienated from each other. So it's an economic growth system that's hurting us in all sorts of different manifestations. And I think in a way this little cartoon from a wonderful Australian cartoonist called Michael Leunig sums it up rather poignantly in that little character here says, yes, the economy has never been healthier, and the responses and the drugs needed to cope with that have never been more affordable. Now, probably any other audience I would have shown that map of the Glasgow rail map that you've probably all seen, but we know how this translates. in terms of life expectancy here in Glasgow, in terms of just very, very unequal life expectancy. When people are feeling that the system is not working for them, they're reaching for coping mechanisms, whether that's at the pillbox or, as we see around the world, at the ballot box. And so what is happening here, in terms that the economic system that has, admittedly, when it's been used well and directed to those who need it most, delivered a whole lot of different aspects of progress and benefit. But are those fruits of growth beginning to rot? What is it that's going on? And so there's 3 concepts that I want to share with you that at least Jeremy and I in the book found useful in getting our heads around that process of, yes, there have been benefits from growth when they've been used well, but they're starting to tail off, they're starting to rot. And the first one is this idea that if any of you have studied economics, you would have learnt probably in your first year of diminishing marginal returns. If you don't study economics, but you're used to going to your local fish and chips and putting a bit of salt on your fish and chips, you'll know that without it, it's you can be sick actually, but with a little bit of salt, things get better. But too much, you very quickly, the returns start to tail off. They become more marginal and actually they can be harmful. Well, so it is with growth. Without it, actually I'll show you this one first. Without it, we're not going to have a chance of achieving some of those very important measures of social progress, for example, reduced poverty, increased life expectancy, increased levels of health and so on. This is work done by our partners, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, the Social Progress Imperative, and they've created something called the Social Progress Index, and it's a chart of over 50 different dimensions of social progress, things like life expectancy, education, opportunity, free press, those sorts of things. And then they've mapped that along the y-axis, and here along the x-axis, they've put various countries according to their GDP per capita. And you can see here, at fairly early stages of economic development in terms of GDP per capita, you get very quick returns. So this is the equivalent of sprinkling the salt on the fish and chips. Things get better pretty quickly. But they start to tail off. So the returns become more marginal. And just to give you one example, you can see Costa Rica up here has almost identical levels of social progress as South Korea over here, but a difference in terms of GDP per capita of 20,000 US a year. The other chart this is a different way of looking at a fairly similar concept. This is something called the Genuine Progress Indicator, and this has been calculated for various countries, but here for the world. And essentially a really shorthand way of explaining the Genuine Progress Indicator is they take GDP and correct it. So they add in some good things like green space or volunteering, and they take out some things that I think we'd probably all agree are harmful to a notion of genuine progress, like inequality or commuting or pollution. And what you can see here is that in that post-war era, what people would refer to as the golden age of capitalism, genuine progress and GDP per capita were rising fairly much in parallel. And then and it was 1978, and we can have a discussion about what sort of policy regimes came in after 1978. But after 1978, the Genuine Progress Indicator flatlined, and largely due to environmental harm and levels of economic inequality, whereas GDP per capita roughly has sort of continued on upwards, and you get bigger gap between the two. So essentially, while growth does matter when it's used well and goes to those who need it most, the returns start to tail off. We get diminishing marginal returns. Another challenge, the second of the 3, is this idea of failure demand. Now, Scottish audiences are probably more familiar with this concept because it was made public back in 2012 with the Christie Commission, this idea that so much of what local authorities spend is due to our failure to help people live good lives, due to inequality and poverty. And so we have to invest in reactive downstream mitigation expenditure. It's a concept that comes from management literature, basically saying just because you're getting more demand for something doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing. And it comes from in management thinking about the complaints line for a firm. Just because loads of people are ringing that's not necessarily a good sign for the firm. But so it is with our policies in our society and our economies. Just because there's more expenditure, we have to look at what's the demand for that, what's driving the pressures. And so You only have to look at, for example, Joseph Rowntree Foundation reporting that almost 80 billion, 1 in 5 of public expenditure, 1 in 5 pounds, but 80 billion pounds each year gets spent on helping people make up for the harm that poverty does to their lives. The Christie Commission that I already mentioned estimated that about 40% of what local authorities spend is due to failure demand. In the US, it's estimated that about 5 million people work in what's been described by Harvard academics as guard labour. So whether that's security guards or in the defence sectors or so on, basically because we're scared of each other. We're expending all sorts of money because we're worried about each other. And you can think about it also in environmental terms. So ecological economists would talk of defensive expenditure, and this week more than other weeks, that's absolutely on the headlines of our daily newspapers. So in Australia, think how much money they are spending fighting those unprecedented levels of bushfires, and then how much money they'll have to spend building back towns and communities and families after the damage of those bushfires. Think about how much money is being invested relocating families down in Yorkshire and then building back, cleaning up their houses, rebuilding their properties after those floods. So there's this defensive expenditure aspect of this as well. And then the third, I saw this a couple of weeks ago in a street in Glasgow, and I think it just actually sums up the, I guess, inefficiency, perversity of this idea of failure demand, that you can create damage to yourself by doing something that you then have to go and spend to fix and heal. And I think the lesson is come to talks like this rather than go to CrossFit on a Friday morning. Save your money on both counts. And here, this is where essentially the sort of social democratic policy consensus has got to in Western Europe, I guess to an extent in the UK as well, that we've been told this is success. So redistributing is a sign of progress because we're redistributing the unequal outcomes. But when do we stop and say, actually, why have we allowed the gap to get so wide in the first place? And we're telling ourselves all this investment and expenditure on rebalancing, redistributing, cleaning up, fixing, healing, repair. We're seeing that as a success. Now, I spent almost 10 years working for a charity that had a huge component of its work, a humanitarian work, so I don't want to ever suggest that this sort of expenditure, this humanitarian support to help people cope with today's, I'd say, inhumane economic system is a bad thing. We should always be helping people cope and survive. But the challenge is if that's all we're doing, we won't be helping transform the very root causes of what's going on. We'll come back to that. And then the final concept, it's taken from one of my favourite economists, a Chilean who's just died a couple of months ago, Manfred Max Neef. And he talks about this idea of pseudo-satisfiers. And so he became famous through his work on fundamental human needs. And basically his point is that wherever you are in the world, people have very similar innate human needs. And because cultures differ and people differ, we satisfy them in very different ways. The problem is in places like the UK, and I'd suggest Glasgow with its consumerist economic mentality, we're so often reaching for what Max Neef would describe as pseudo-satisfiers. And I think that's the same with GDP as a measure of progress and being used as a means to deliver what we really want, what's decent quality lives, secure livelihoods, quality natural environment. No longer is GDP as a measure of progress and an economic system both based upon that, delivering the goods. That read across that we used to be able to expect is starting to break down because of the environmental breakdown, economic inequality, and the fact that so many people are hurting from this system of economic growth that we've got. So it's a pseudo-satisfier. And it's the same at the individual level as well, as I've already alluded to. You now have companies suggesting that our very innate human needs for social affiliation can be as easily met as just reaching for a bottle of Coke. Or this was at my local newsagent recently. There seems to be this sort of flourishing of, in industry basically tapping into this idea of happiness and creating these magazines right next to the cake decoration and the interior design. And so I was curious about, what are the routes to happiness that would be suggested by this particular magazine, or this rather disgustingly titled Happy Neds. And so I opened up the contents and said, what are they suggesting? How can we have a higher quality of life or higher levels of well-being as defined by happiness? We can come back to those definitions in questions if you want. And so I looked at the contents, and basically, apparently, according to the happiness magazine industry, it's take your dog for a walk, do some meditation, have your friends round for drinks, go to Thailand and go running in the park. Now, of course, they're probably quite nice and they probably would increase your happiness, but if you're lucky enough to be able to live in an area where you feel safe going outside, running for a walk, if you're not doing 3 jobs just to keep your families above the breadline, if you can afford to go to Thailand, and if you've got enough disposable income that you can have your friends around for a week. So that's my Friday morning dig at the happiness industry. I'm happy to come back to that later. But essentially, you pull all that together, the extent to which the returns in terms of social progress to a GDP-led economy are starting to tail off. They're becoming more marginal. In fact, a lot of what would count as a positive on the GDP ledger is actually us spending on failure demand, on defensive expenditure to heal, to treat, to fix, and to clean up some of the damage that we've done, pushing down on the pedal of trying to get more growth out of the economy. And then actually we're in a situation where we're reaching for pseudo-satisfiers. And Manfred Max Neef would warn that the more we do that, we actually create more harm in trying to actually reach what we really need to satisfy our fundamental human needs. Now, the extent to which we have to be ambitious in terms of designing and imagining a new system is enormous. And you've probably heard more and more people talking about this idea of a wellbeing economy. We're really delighted at the extent to which the conversation is bubbling up. The challenge is, it is not good enough just to do a few nice little tweaks and put a few ribbons on some policies. We absolutely need to have a conversation about fundamental transformation and repurposing of the economic system. And this will tell you why. So this is a mapping done by colleagues of ours down at the University of Leeds by ecological economists. And they looked around the world for an economy that can deliver good lives for people in the average sense. So of course, that's meaning it's sort of the tyranny of averages is masking all inequality within countries. But bear with me on that front for the purpose of this graph. So in average sense, lifting citizens above the social foundation that you might think of. But at the same time, are any of those economies not putting undue pressure on the planet? So not transgressing biophysical boundaries. And so they looked around the world and said, are there any countries and economies that we can learn from in that respect? And you've probably guessed it now. The bad news is that we've got a big white space. No countries get close. We've either got fairly GDP-rich countries that in an average sense, and we've just seen how much inequality there is in those countries, but in an average sense, their citizens do okay. But at the same time, they're transgressing a huge number of biophysical boundaries. Or you get low-income countries that are not putting pressure on the planet, but they're also not lifting their citizens above a social foundation. So this begs of us, actually, that we create a new economic system. And that means going back to root causes, really asking why and why and why. And this is a photo of my little nephew, William, and he's gone through the age. If any of you have got young kids or grandchildren or nieces or nephews, you'll understand this when they go through this age where they're always saying, but why, but why, but why? And I think we need to be more like William, because we need to not be content with just celebrating ourselves when we do a marginal increase on the out of work, poverty income, or we celebrate ourselves for taking a plastic bag full of baked beans to the soup kitchen or the food bank, or we celebrate ourselves for donating to families impacted by the floods down in Yorkshire. What we need to do is really ask, but why? What is going on? Why are more people turning to food banks? Why are more people homeless? Why is there flooding in Yorkshire at the same time as catastrophic bushfires in Australia? We need to be more like William, really going upstream. And that then demands that we have a massive conversation about repurposing the economy. And so I guess to sum up where we are at the moment, it has been observed that this current economic system is not a success. It's not intelligent, it's not beautiful, it's not just, and it's not delivering the goods. And you can see that in the environmental harm, the inequality, and the fact that people are starting to get angry at this economic system. People are disliking it and despising it. And then the final point this person made was, when it comes to what to put in its place, we are extremely perplexed. This was John Maynard Keynes writing in 1933. I think, though, the good news is in that, as we come to the end of 2019, where political leaders around the world are starting to ask questions about a different way of doing the economy, we do know what to put in its place. And for us, we call it a well-being economy. I don't mind if you call it donut economy or solidarity economy or circular economy or regenerative economy. The core thing is that these things are all united by some key beliefs about what the economy should be about. And to get a sense of that, you only need to turn the pages of great development scholars like here's Manfred Max Neef, my favourite, or Amartya Sen or Martha Nussbaum, when they talk about what the real purpose of human progress is and what the purpose of human development is. Or you need to look at the brain scans produced by neuroscientists when they're telling us what makes us happy, when do bits of our brain light up, when is the cortisol not rushing through our veins because we're no longer stressed, when we're content and relaxed. You also need to just listen to epidemiologists or psychologists about the real causes of mental and physical health. I'd say perhaps most importantly, you hear about what the economy should be purposed for when you sit down with communities around the world, whether it's in the slums of Delhi or the Amazon in Brazil or just over the road in Govan, and have a conversation with people about what really, really matters to them. These are photos from a project I led many, many years ago called the Humankind Index. We replicated that with colleagues in India, and then friends of mine did a similar project in Namibia. So very, very different locations, but they were all about asking people what really, really matters to you. And they came up with almost identical answers. We'll come back to that. And so building a wellbeing economy is about ensuring collective well-being. So not just about, on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you, but really collective well-being at the societal level for people and for planet. Making sure that everyone's fundamental needs are met, so reducing that huge inequality that we talked about, sharing resources, and recognising that no longer is it good enough just to see the economy as something that it can take and pillage from the natural world, but recognising that the economy is a subset of society and that the two are a subset of the natural world. And so that means saying we can do better than just fixing and healing and cleaning up. Actually, we can create an economy that gets things right first time round. And so that means this really ugly term, pre-distribution, but it's essentially about getting the economy to do more of the heavy lifting through things like pre-distribution, so expecting more of the market outcome. Do you know, in market terms, if we park the state, the UK economy generates more unequal outcomes than the US economy. So then we have a very heavy effort from various state mechanisms to try and redistribute that. And if you only have to look around to say that's getting harder and harder, and we're doing a pretty rubbish job at it. So we have to turn our attention to asking the economy to do more of the heavy lifting. It's things like economic democracy, so sharing ownership, sharing wealth, harnessing the foundational economy and building wealth from the bottom upwards through the community wealth building agenda that's really beautifully starting to build a head of steam here in Scotland. And it's also about really measuring what matters. In GDP terms, so much of what boosts GDP is our spending on failure demand. It's blind to distribution. It's consumption orientated, so it drives us into more production that's so bad for the environment. What we need to do is to have a better measure of progress. And as a footnote in terms of sort of the Green New Deal conversations, gross domestic product was created to help Roosevelt measure the impact of the Green New Deal. Now that we're talking of the New Deal, now that we're talking about a Green New Deal, we absolutely need to have a conversation about what's the right measure of progress for how we're going to transform our economies. The good news is that there are long roots of this conversation about transforming the economy and lots happening. And I just want to walk through you some of them so that you see that there is a bit of a momentum around this. And you could argue that the roots of this conversation hark back to 1968 to Senator Robert Kennedy's speech. Have you heard his speech? No. Okay, so you'll probably hear it quoted. The First Minister likes to quote it, where she says, GDP measures everything but that which makes life worthwhile. It's actually quite boring to read it written now. Go onto YouTube, type in Robert Kennedy GDP speech. It's one of the most beautiful, poetic tirades against gross domestic product that you're ever likely to hear. It's absolutely worth listening to rather than just reading the words written down. Sadly, he was, of course, assassinated just a few months after that speech, but it makes it even more poignant when you're listening to it. But just a couple of years after that, of course, we had the Club of Rome, so systems scholars from MIT publishing their Limits to Growth report. And so much of that, from scholars who have analysed their predictions, it's been found to be on track. And they, of course, just like scientists earlier this year in the Global Biodiversity Assessment, the authors, Donella Meadows and so on, they pointed to economic growth as the key lever about are we going to live within the limits. Then that same year you had the King of Bhutan saying that it's gross national happiness that's more important than GDP per capita. Race forward a few years, we of course had the global financial crisis. A year after that, Sarkozy had commissioned scholars like Amartya Sen, Joseph Stiglitz and Jean-Paul Fatoussi to do a report on the measures of progress and the commission on the measures of progress. And that again kicked off a lot of conversations that Carnegie were really involved in around can we do better than just looking at gross domestic product. A couple of years later, we had a UN report led by Bhutan on a new development paradigm and a whole lot of resolutions around that. A couple of years later, in 2015, we had the Sustainable Development Goals signed. They, of course, point to a very different purpose and goal for the economic system than just increasing GDP and just being dependent on growth. A couple of years later, there was an update of the Stiglitz report for Sarkozy, and this was commissioned by the OECD. And Joseph Stiglitz was one of the key authors of this, and they said that since the financial crisis, an undue narrow focus on increasing GDP, like basically recovering the economy in GDP terms, has exacerbated financial insecurity for people in various countries around the OECD. We also had my little organisation, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, launched, and also the launch of the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership, which I'll come back to in a minute. We've, of course, just starting from last year, but really building momentum, seen young people coming out of their classrooms to saying we need to transform how we do policy making if we're going to have a chance, really have a hope for their own future. Earlier this year, we had a group of academics, over 200 of them, writing to the European Union saying, enough of your growth and stability pact. What we actually need is a well-being and sustainability pact. They called it dethrone King GDP and crown Queen Wellbeing, which I thought was a bit naff, but you get the point what they're saying. A couple of weeks later, of course, we had New Zealand launching its wellbeing budget. Just last month, we've had the Finnish presidency leading on the economy of wellbeing. I've got a lot of quibbles about that, so there's a little frowny face here. You probably can't see that. Please ask me that in questions so I can tell you why. And so on and so on. There's really roots to this conversation, and they're broad-based across the economy. Of course, on top of all of this, got a lot of captains of industry, such as Larry Fink from BlackRock, and various other, Paul Polman from Unilever, really pointing out how we need to transform how business is done as well. And so what it looks like, just to give you a sense of what it looks like in practice, it's about businesses and organisations that are ensuring that work is decent, that it's paid enough, that it's not long hours, that it's shared better across the population. Whether we see that in Dutch companies or businesses around the world that are saying, let's try a 4-day week, and actually we'll get more from our workers because they'll be happier, more content, and less stressed, and that's got an environmental benefit as well. It's business organisations that saying, yeah, we still want to be a successful business. We want to be commercially profitable, successful and viable. It's not about being anti-business, but we're going to do that for a different purpose than just extracting short-term profit for the few. We're going to do that for the purpose of investing in delivering social and environmental returns, whether that's cooperatives or social enterprises or community interest companies or B Corps or the economy for the common good companies that take us really on a much more radical repurposing of the economy. There's this growing, what's being called by Gerard Sabiti, a Harvard economist, the growing fourth sector. There are so many different business models that are starting to find ways to design and repurpose and even shift their DNA so that they focus on environmental and social pursuits. And of course, it's how we design cities, whether it's about for consumerism or for communities coming together in choirs, whether it's for petrol or for plants, whether they're built on renewable energy. It's really about how we think about what our infrastructure's for, how we're planning, what sort of activities and businesses are we going to license and incentivize to come into our high streets. It's about the collaborative and the circular economy, and collaborative in the sense of sharing books or tools or toy libraries or cars or co-housing, where you have, for example, down in Leeds, 45 families living in a community called Lilac saying, actually, we don't all need to have our very own washing machine. We can share 4 washing machines quite happily with each other, and then massive benefit for the environment from that. They've got one car that they share amongst all these 25 families. The circular economy you've probably all heard about, and Scotland's got, of course, a really, really good track record on building and incentivising and supporting the circular economy. But it's basically saying that this take, make, waste model is something that needs to be consigned to the 21st century, and it's about cradle to cradle design and manufacturing. So you now have car companies like Renault, where 90% of the components of their cars are designed for recycling. That huge shipping company, Maersk, every ship they now make has a blueprint inside it about how to unpack it and reuse every little component. The really famous example is Philips, who no longer will sell you light bulbs, but they'll sell you lighting. And so the unit that they talk about is Lux, and they supply all of Schiphol Airport with this Lux that they provide. So it's their job to take back the light bulbs themselves and replace them, because what they're doing is ensuring the units of Lux, rather than the light bulbs themselves. This is my absolute favourite example though. This is up in Isla, where waste heat from the Bowmore distillery is used to heat the local community swimming pool. It's just sort of the really obvious sort of solution that you get when communities are in the same place and able to take those decisions. But there are so many examples of the circular economy. So of course about having all of this powered by renewable energy, and there are so many examples of increasing ambition across the world in terms of going renewable. It's about how we do community planning and participatory budgeting, and Scotland of course is having a conversation, I'd say a little bit in too much of a timid way, about participatory budgeting, because we see this happening in countries like Portugal, in Paris, in New York, that divvies up around 30 million a year by participatory budgeting processes. It's about these students also, it's about, and this comes back to your skills conversation around, how are we teaching ourselves? These are economics students, started in Manchester, but now it's become a global event where they're coming out of their classrooms and saying to their economics professors, it is no longer good enough for you to teach us economics as if the environment is simply an externality, as if human beings are rational economic actors that aren't influenced by social concerns or advertising or framing or herd instinct or so on. We need to think about how we teach economics. It's about what they're doing in Wales, creating a Future Generations Commissioner whose job it is to scrutinise every bit of legislation in terms of how it impacts the well-being of current and future generations. And the one I'm particularly proud of is a group of governments led by Scotland, but with New Zealand and Iceland, who are wanting to come together to collaborate, to share and to exchange, called the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership, around how to build well-being into economic policy making. And forgive the photo, this is at the First Policy Lab. I was trying to very subtly take a photo of the First Minister, the Prime Minister of Iceland, Katherine Jakobsdóttir, and Carrie Exton from the OECD. I was trying to be very subtle and hence very, very blurry. But this was the First Policy Lab they had back in May. This initiative was launched at the OECD in November last year. And at this Policy Lab, the First Minister really admitted that GDP has become to be seen as a measure, but basically recognising how GDP has become so entrenched in our measure of the country's success, but there's this growing realisation that it's not the measure of a successful economy And we need to think about much more priority to quality of life. And then, of course, a few months later, she went on and did her TED talk on the sort of the red dot of the global stage, really talking about why we need to move beyond GDP and how we go, as this initiative is going to go about doing that. So all of that's really nice. I hope you think there's lots going on. There's some good head of steam around this. But the risk is that so many of these initiatives are happening despite rather than because of the system. They're up against considerable headwinds. So how do we start to pull it together and go beyond just tweaking and putting nice little bows along the various policy initiatives? How do we actually get ambitious and gear up for something that has to amount for system change? And let me scroll through a bit. So why we need to actually, let me go back to this for a minute. Ronald Reagan, who's someone I'm surprised to find myself quoting, but Ronald Reagan back in the early 80s said to people, there is no limits to growth because there is no limits to human ingenuity and our imagination. And I think now we're at the situation where it is our limited imaginations, where we've been boxed into thinking that the best we can do is put a nice adjective onto growth, whether that's inclusive growth or sustainable growth or pro-poor growth or low carbon growth. We think that's the best we can do. So it's our limited imagination that's boxing us in to an economic system that's just dependent on growth. What we need to do is have wider imaginations to develop an economy that's better than growth. And that requires us going across all systems, all layers of the system. And so this is something called the multi-level system perspective, and it basically points to the fact that you get niche level, sort of micro level examples. These are individual businesses, individual projects, individual initiatives. Above them, you get the policy regime. So this is things like taxes, incentives, all the sort of policy decisions that happen in various parliaments. But crucially above that, you're talking about the macro level of the very purpose of the economy, technological landscape, the environment, those sorts of things. And they all matter because they all incentivize, they all influence each other. What we need to do is be moving the conversation across all of those layers about a different economic system. And so that is what we all has been set up to do. There's a global conversation around it, and then there's also a Scottish and other country sort of local iterations, if you like. Rather beautifully, Wellbeing Economy Alliance shortens to We All. And essentially that's what we're all about, really trying to support what is already going on, really trying to amplify the work of these pioneers, whether they're businesses, whether they're policymakers, whether they're community groups who are rolling up their sleeves and starting to embody what a wellbeing economy might be like. But also, this is really lonely, being out here on the wire by yourself. So we want to support them and help them connect and be part of a wider movement. And essentially, that's about building a power base to move what's called the Overton window, this idea that we can move the public conversation so that the political appetite moves and makes the sort of shifts and policy changes needed acceptable. This was sent to me by a friend of mine who in Australia had been fighting for decades really around gay marriage. And I think it's a beautiful example of just how the conversation has to be so tenacious and persistent. We talked about courageous persistence when we met a few months ago, I think. And do you know what? The GDP conversation has moved through these stages. When I first worked on the Humankind Index many, many years ago, I would have to spend about half of my meeting with colleagues, with civil servants, really outlining some of the flaws of GDP. Now, not because of me, because of that wider movement I told you about, but that conversation has moved on now. I think people recognise that gross domestic product is a really harmful measure of the economy, pretty inadequate measure of the economy, and a really harmful measure of society's success. So things are moving. We're also working about how do we talk about the economy and how do we paint a picture of a much more optimistic, desirable future that is feasible and desirable. Because as you can see here, how we talk about things, how we frame things really, really matters. So we're working with storytellers, with advertising executives to try and think about how do we just build that wider imagination and more ambition in that about how we can transform the economy. And essentially, this is our theory of change. This idea that if we work together and connect and collaborate, we can do extraordinary things. So We All is about connecting, amplifying, and increasing the impact. I want to bring it back to skills and the conversation around I hope that you might be having in your meetings and around the water cooler and in the corridor, but essentially about what does this growing attention and growing discussion about a wellbeing economy, what might it actually mean for this sort of mindset and hence skills shift that we need. And so we have to talk about skills for system change agents. Who are going to be the people that have the skills and the tenacity to look upstream, to be like my little nephew William and ask, but why, but why, but why? To make the connections between investment in the education budget and how that might actually show up in the police budget's bottom line. To not being content just to celebrate success by slightly mitigating harm or helping people cope with the current system, or telling them even worse to just be more resilient. But the people whose mindsets and attitudes helps them say we can do better than that, we can be bolder than that. And it's a big challenge to universities that are so often default to those reductionist sort of departmental silos and their disciplines where they go deep but they don't go broad. And you should watch academics trying to do multidisciplinary work. They hate it. That this is the thing we need, is skill sets for people to look across science, to the arts, to sociology, to medicine, and really understand what that means for building a different economy. We also need skills for the transition. So to give you one example, I think the wellbeing economy and the circular economy as a component of that presents a potential for reindustrialisation of some of our communities that have gone through that post-industrial transition, that had the economic rug pulled out from under them when we closed shipyards and manufacturing and so on. But there are people there who are not going to get a job in the sort of jobs that are on offer in Scotland right now, whether it's in Topshop or riding an Uber Eats bicycle. But they are people who might be really, really useful in the sort of repair provision with a craft provision, those sorts of businesses that have to be local if we're going to have a proper circular economy. So what are the skills that are required for that? To help people who maybe used to work on the shipyards actually set up a business in their local community that's repairing DVD players or microwaves or kettles, so that people aren't throwing them out and buying them again, that actually we can have a proper circular economy. And how can we do so in a way that they feel that they've got a secure future and a pathway to that rather than feeling precarious? And then the other aspect, of course, is skills for business. How can businesses think differently about what their purpose is about, how they design the very organisation of their business, what's the DNA, what's the governance structure, how can they count in their environmental impact, how can they find a way to measure and hence celebrate and hence increase their social impact. And of course that goes to the advice that is being given to business, whether it's accountants or people at Business Gateway and so on. How can we encourage people to have the right skills to create the sort of businesses that we need for a wellbeing economy? So it's a whole lot of this transition depends on a new sort of cadre, new sort of composition of skill sets. I'm going to stop there because I've talked, for way too long. But I'd love to hear what you think, and if you want to dive deep into some of these questions, there's that. But also I'll be around afterwards to chat. Thank you.
Thanks very much.